It is a strange kind of truth, rarely spoken aloud in the great packs of the North, that a king who has everything is often the poorest man in the room. He has land, he has soldiers, he has a throne carved from black oak and older than memory, and still the council meets behind closed doors to decide who he will wake up next to for the rest of his life. Cassian Ashgrove, Alpha King of the Blackthorn realm, had learned this lesson the hard way, and he was about to learn it again. "The realm needs an heir bonded before the solstice," said Elder Marrow, not for the first time that week. "Your father secured 3 decades of peace with his marriage. Yours is already 3 years overdue." "My father married for love," Cassian said, not looking up from the reports on his desk. "I don't recall that being the argument you used with him. Your father also had the luxury of falling in love with someone the council approved of." Marrow's voice had the patience of a man who had said this speech 100 times and expected to say it 100 more. "You do not have that luxury. You have 5 days. Cassian set down his pen. 5 days until the solstice ball, the night the old laws required an unmated Alpha King to either present a bonded mate or open his throne to challenge. It was an ancient rule, built for an age when kings died young and pacts needed certainty, and it had outlived its usefulness by several centuries in his opinion. Unfortunately, opinions did not repeal laws. "Find someone," Marrow said. "Anyone with a claim clean enough to hold. I don't care who." He would remember those words later. I don't care who. They would come back to him with a kind of grim irony he could not yet imagine. 3 villages away, in the low, sloped houses that clung to the eastern border of the realm, a woman named Wren Calder was learning her own hard lesson about what people meant when they said they cared for her. "You understand," said Talbot, the man she had been promised to since she was 16, "that this isn't personal." "It's remarkably personal," Wren said. "You're ending our engagement in front of my entire village during the harvest fire." I checked. There isn't a more personal way to do it short of writing it on my forehead. Around them, the fire crackled, and the villagers who had gathered to celebrate the season's end had gone very quiet, the way a crowd goes quiet when it senses a story worth remembering. Talbot's new betrothed, a merchant's daughter with a dowry the size of a small kingdom, stood a few feet back, examining her nails with the particular boredom of someone who has already won. "Her family has trade routes into the capital," Talbot said, as though this explained everything, as though love had ever once been about trade routes. "You're a healer's apprentice, with no pack rank and no dowry. Be reasonable, Wren." "I am being reasonable," Wren said. "I'm reasonably calculating how satisfying it would be to set your sleeve on fire right now." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, quickly smothered. Talbot flushed, his jaw tightening in the way it always did when he was embarrassed and needed someone else to be smaller so he could feel larger. "You have no family to defend your honor," he said, lower now. "Meaner, no one of consequence will ever want you, Wren. You should be grateful I gave you this long." Wren felt the words land the way they were meant to, sharp and precise, aimed at the oldest wound she carried. She had no family. Her parents had died when she was an infant, found on the doorstep of the village healer, with nothing but a strange, faint mark at the base of her throat, and no note explaining where she came from. She had grown up grateful for scraps of kindness, and had learned, slowly and painfully, not to expect more than scraps. But she had also learned, somewhere along the way, that she did not have to accept being told what she was worth by a man who measured love in trade routes. "Grateful," she repeated. "Right, well. Consider me appropriately grateful, Talbot, truly. I don't think I've ever been more relieved to be free of anything in my life." She turned before he could answer, walking through the parting crowd with her chin high and her hands shaking only slightly at her sides, and told herself she would not cry until she was well out of sight of the fire. She almost made it. What Ren did not know, as she walked the dark road home with her humiliation still hot on her skin, was that 50 miles north, in a castle she had never seen, a king was staring down the last 5 days of his freedom with a growing, desperate sense that the council's plan, whatever it turned out to be, was going to be a disaster. And what neither of them knew, what no one in the entire realm knew, except a handful of dust-covered records locked in a forgotten archive, was that the mark at the base of Ren's throat, the one she had spent her whole life hiding beneath high collars, was not a birth defect or a curse. It was a signature, and it belonged to a bloodline the kingdom had spent 300 years believing was extinct. 5 days later, the Council of Blackthorn found her anyway, not because they knew what she carried in her blood, because the exhausted, half-joking suggestion of a mid-ranked scout who had passed through her village and heard the story of the healer's apprentice jilted at the harvest fire happened to reach Elder Marrow's ear at exactly the moment he needed a solution simple enough to explain to a king who had stopped listening to complicated ones. She has no family to object, the scout had said, shrugging, no pack politics to navigate. Practically an orphan. Wouldn't cause you any trouble, my lord. She'd probably be grateful for the offer, all things considered. Marrow had smiled the thin, satisfied smile of a man who had just found the path of least resistance and sent riders east before the sun had fully set. Ren was elbow-deep in crushed feverfew when the riders arrived, and her first thought upon seeing the royal insignia stitched into their cloaks was that someone had died, and the healer's cottage had been sent for by mistake. Her second thought, once the lead rider explained himself, was that she must have misheard. The Alpha King requests your presence at the capital, the rider said again, patient in the way of a man reciting a message he did not fully understand himself. As a candidate for his bonded mate. Ren set down her mortar very carefully because her hands had started to shake and she did not want to break anything that belonged to the old healer who had raised her. I think there's been an error. There's been no error. Your name was given to the council directly. By whom? The rider looked, for the first time, faintly uncomfortable. I couldn't say, my lady. She wasn't a lady. She was an apprentice healer, with dirt under her fingernails and a broken engagement barely a week old, and the words sat strangely on her, like a coat cut for someone else's shoulders. But 5 days later, after a journey she spent alternating between disbelief and a low, simmering suspicion that this was some elaborate cruelty orchestrated by Talbot's new family, she stood in the receiving hall of Blackthorn Castle, facing the most powerful man in the kingdom, and understood immediately that this was no joke. Cassian Ashgrove was larger than she expected, and colder, his dark eyes moving over her with the detached efficiency of a man auditing livestock. He did not smile. He did not rise from his seat at the head of the hall. He simply looked at her for a long moment, and then turned to Elder Marrow with an expression that suggested he was already regretting every decision that had led to this room. This is the candidate? Ren Calder, Your Grace. Healer's apprentice. No living family. No pack ties that could complicate the succession. You mean no family that could object when I marry a stranger with 5 days' notice? Cassian's voice was flat, but there was an edge underneath it, aimed less at her than at the entire absurd machinery that had produced this moment. Ren felt her spine straighten despite herself. She had spent a week being talked about as though she weren't in the room, first by Talbot, now by a king, and she found she had run entirely out of patience for it. I can hear you, she said. Both of you. I'm standing right here. Silence fell across the hall, the particular silence of courtiers who cannot quite believe what they've just witnessed. Elder Marrow's face went the color of old parchment. But Cassian, for the first time since she'd entered the room, actually looked at her, properly, the auditing gaze replaced by something sharper and more curious. "So, you can," he said. "Apologies, it's been a difficult week. I imagine it has, given that you're apparently marrying whoever your counsel can find on 5 days' notice." Ren knew she should stop talking. She knew, distantly, that this was a king, and that kings did not typically enjoy being spoken to this way. But something about the exhaustion in his voice, the sense that he was as trapped by this arrangement as she was, made her reckless. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, I didn't ask for this either. I was elbow deep in feverfew paste 4 days ago. This isn't exactly the life I had planned." Something flickered across Cassian's face, there and gone too fast to name. "What life had you planned? One where I got to choose who I spent it with. Small dream, I know." He studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. "You didn't ask for a title. You didn't ask for a throne. Why did you come?" Ren thought of Talbot's voice at the harvest fire. "No one of consequence will ever want you." She thought of a lifetime of being the girl no one claimed, the healer's apprentice, with no name worth mentioning, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever this was, whatever cold political arrangement had produced it, it was still the first time in her life that anyone had come looking for her at all. "Because staying meant being someone's afterthought for the rest of my life," she said honestly. "And I'd rather be a stranger's convenient solution than my old life's leftover." Cassian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd offended him. Instead, he rose from his seat, crossed the hall, and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I won't pretend this is a romance," he said quietly, "for her ears only. I won't pretend I chose you out of anything but necessity. But I will not treat you the way it sounds like you've been treated. You have my word on that, whatever it's worth to a stranger." "It's worth something," Ren said, surprising herself. "More than I expected. Honestly. Then we understand each other." He extended a hand, an old gesture, formal and strange between two people who had known each other for the length of a single conversation. "Marry me out of necessity," Ren called her. "And I'll make certain necessity treats you better than pity ever has." She looked at his hand for a long moment, at the calluses across his knuckles, the weight of a crown he clearly hadn't asked for either, and thought that perhaps two people bound together by nothing but bad timing and worse alternatives might, at the very least, understand each other's exhaustion. She took his hand. Behind them, Elder Marrow exhaled a breath he had apparently been holding since the healer's apprentice had first spoken out of turn, and began, with visible relief, to draft the announcement. Neither Cassian nor Ren noticed the old blind woman who had slipped quietly into the back of the hall during the exchange, drawn by nothing she could name but a pull in the air like the moment before lightning, or the way her clouded eyes had fixed, unerringly, on the base of Ren's throat, where a faint mark lay hidden beneath the collar of her traveling cloak. The wedding was, by every measure the court cared about, a disaster of taste. There had been no time for a proper gown, so Ren stood at the altar in a dress borrowed from a seamstress who normally outfitted minor nobles for minor occasions, its hem let out hastily to fit, and its color a shade of ivory that did not quite match anything else in the room. There had been no time for a guest list either, which meant the ballroom was filled with courtiers who had heard about the marriage only that morning and had spent the intervening hours doing furious, whispered arithmetic about what a healer's apprentice with no family could possibly offer their king. "No dowry," she heard one noblewoman murmur to another, not quietly enough. "No pack. I heard she doesn't even know her own parents' names." "Desperation," the other replied. "The solstice deadline. You understand. He'd have married a serving girl if one had been standing closer." Ren kept her eyes forward and her spine straight, the way she had learned to do at the harvest fire, and told herself that she had survived worse rooms than this one. She had survived rooms where people said crueler things directly to her face. A little whispering behind silk fans was almost restful by comparison. Beside her, Cassian caught the tail end of the second comment and, without turning his head, said, low enough for only her to hear. Would you like me to have her removed from the hall? For gossiping? Your Grace, half the room would need to go with her. I have guards for a reason. I don't need defending, Ren said, though something in her chest loosened slightly at the offer. I've been called worse by better people. That's not a comfort. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be true. She glanced sideways at him, at the tension in his jaw, the way he seemed to be bracing against the whole ceremony, as though it were a blow he was determined not to flinch from. You don't have to protect my pride, Cassian. I gave that up for practical reasons a long time ago. Maybe I'm protecting mine, he said. It reflects poorly on a king to let his own court insult his wife in front of him. Ah, so, it's about you. The corner of his mouth twitched, the first almost smile she'd seen from him. Everything is about me. Didn't anyone explain that before you agreed to marry a king? They left that part out, actually, along with several other important details I'm noticing. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of old words and older rituals, a binding of blood and bond performed by the same elders who had spent 5 days engineering the whole arrangement, and when it was finished, Ren Calder was, improbably, impossibly, the Luna of the Blackthorn realm, bonded to a king who had chosen her because she was convenient, and no one would object. The feast that followed was worse than the ceremony. Nobles approached her table in a slow, curious parade, offering congratulations phrased so carefully as insults that Ren began to suspect there was a school somewhere that taught the art. How resourceful of you, said a lord, whose name she didn't catch, to find your way into a crown, with nothing but a healer's satchel. How resourceful of the council, Ren replied sweetly, to solve a 5-day crisis with a healer's satchel. I'm sure they'll write songs about their ingenuity. The lord's smile faltered, and he retreated more quickly than he'd arrived. Across the table, Cassian, who had been half listening while pretending to review a report a steward had handed him, looked up with something that might have been approval. You're better at this than I expected, he said. I've had a lifetime of practice being underestimated. Turns out it's useful training for being a queen no one respects. Luna, he corrected. We don't use queen here. Noted. Luna no one respects then rolls off the tongue less easily, but I'll adjust. Give it time, Cassian said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, an offer she hadn't expected from a man who had made it very clear this marriage was a transaction. They didn't respect me either, when I first took the crown. Too young, they said. Too untested. It took years to earn what should have simply been given. And now? Now they fear me enough to call it respect. He said it without pride, almost with distaste, as though the distinction troubled him more than he let on. It's not the same thing. I'm aware of that. Ren studied him for a moment, this cold, careful king who had just admitted, in the middle of his own wedding feast, that he understood the difference between fear and respect, and wished he'd been given the second instead of settling for the first. It was the most honest thing anyone in the entire castle had said to her since she'd arrived. Maybe we'll earn the real thing eventually, she said. Both of us. Together, since apparently that's the arrangement now. Cassian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes, and then he lifted his glass in her direction. The smallest, most private toast she had ever witnessed. Together then, he said. Necessity's newest business partners. She clinked her glass against his, and neither of them noticed the old blind woman standing near the far wall, unmoving amid the swirl of dancing courtiers, her clouded eyes fixed on the new Luna with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition. The old woman found her 3 nights later, in the castle gardens, where Wren had taken to walking, when the walls of the palace felt too much like a cage dressed up as a gift. "You'll catch a chill," the woman said, emerging from the shadow of a hedge with the soundless ease of someone who had spent decades moving through this garden. Her eyes were clouded white, blind by every visible measure, and yet she walked without hesitation, without a hand extended to feel her way. "Though I suppose chills are the least of what's coming for you, Luna." Wren startled, one hand flying to the collar of her cloak. "Who are you?" "Old Marin. I keep the archive beneath the east wing. No one visits me anymore, which suits me fine. Mostly, the dust doesn't ask questions." Marin tilted her head, and though her eyes could not possibly see, Wren had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being studied. "May I see your throat, child?" That's a strange request from a stranger. I've earned stranger ones in my life. Humor an old woman. Marin's voice had none of the court's practiced cruelty, only a kind of tired urgency, as though she had been waiting a long time to ask this question and did not intend to wait any longer than necessary. "I felt something the night you married the king. A pull in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. I have felt it only once before in my life, 70 years ago, and it did not end well for the person who carried it. I would like to know if I am about to watch history repeat itself." Something in the old woman's voice, the weight of genuine fear beneath the calm words, made Wren's hand fall away from her collar, almost against her will. She loosened the fabric, exposing the faint, silvery mark at the base of her throat that she had spent her entire life hiding beneath high necklines, the mark the healer who raised her had called a birth blemish and told her never to speak of. Marin went very still. "Ember and ash," she whispered. "It's true. After 300 years, it's true. What's true? What is this?" Wren's fingers hovered near the mark, an old defensive instinct. "I've been told my whole life it was nothing. A blemish. Something to hide. It is not nothing." Marin reached out, her fingers hovering just above the mark without touching it, as though it radiated a heat only she could feel. "It is the sigil of House Emberwood, the last royal bloodline of the old kingdom that stood on this land before Blackthorn was built on its ashes, a line of shifters who did not simply command wolves, but carried the old fire in their blood, the heart flame, which could wake the dormant magic beneath these mountains and shield an entire realm from ruin." Wren stared at her. "That's not possible. That bloodline is a story. A legend parents tell children. It died out centuries ago. That is what the histories say, because that is what the conquerors who slaughtered them wanted history to say." Marin's clouded eyes had a terrible clarity to them despite their blindness. "But bloodlines are stubborn things, child. They do not die simply because it is convenient for someone that they should. They hide. They scatter. They wait in healers' cottages and orphaned infants left on doorsteps with nothing but a mark and no explanation, until the day comes when the realm needs them again." Wren's breath had gone shallow. She thought of her earliest memory, the healer telling her, gently, that she had been found as an infant with nothing but a blanket and that strange mark. No note, no name, no family ever coming to claim her. She had spent her whole life believing that absence meant she was unwanted. She had never once considered that it might have meant she was hidden. "Why does it matter now?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Why does any of this matter now, after 300 years?" Marin's expression darkened, the urgency in her voice sharpening into something closer to dread, Because the shadow blight is spreading along the northern border faster than any healer or soldier can hold it back, and the old defenses that once protected this realm were built on emberwood fire. Without that bloodline, those defenses have been failing for 300 years. Slowly, the way a wall crumbles, stone by stone, until the day it simply falls. The king's advisors have been quietly preparing for the possibility that Blackthorn cannot survive another decade of the blight's spread. And you, Luna, appear to be the answer to a problem no one thought could be solved. I don't know how to be anyone's answer, Ren said. I'm a healer's apprentice. I know how to set bones and brew fever tonics. I don't know anything about ancient fire or dormant magic or saving a kingdom. No one does. At first. Marin finally let her hand rest, light as a moth, against Ren's collarbone just above the mark. But the fire does not care whether you feel ready for it, child. It only cares whether you carry it. And you do. I have not been wrong about a pull in the air in 70 years, and I am not wrong now. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a branch cracked, too deliberate to be the wind, and both women went still. When Ren turned toward the sound, she caught only the barest impression of a shadow retreating into the dark, there and gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. We are not the only ones in this garden tonight, Marin murmured, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. You should tell your king what you carry, Luna, before someone who wishes the Emberwood line had stayed extinct decides to make certain it does. Ren found Cassian in his study long past midnight, bent over maps of the northern border, marked with dark ink, where the shadow blight had crept forward another mile since the last report. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted at the sight of her face, pale and tight with a tension he clearly hadn't seen on her before. What's happened? I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide whether to believe me. She told him everything. The mark she had, hidden her whole life. Marin's words in the garden. The bloodline everyone believed extinct. The shadow moving in the hedges that neither of them had gotten a clear look at. Cassian listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing until she finished. And then he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the maps on his desk as though they might rearrange themselves into an answer. Show me, he said finally. Ren loosened her collar, exposing the mark, and Cassian rose from his desk and crossed the room to look at it properly, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that her pulse picked up in a way that had nothing to do with fear of what the mark might mean. I've seen this before, he said slowly. Not on a person. In the old records, the ones from before Blackthorn's founding. There are drawings of it on the ruins near the northern pass, carved into stone that predates every wall my family ever built. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and the careful distance he had maintained between them since their wedding seemed, for the first time, to crack. Marrow searched for months for a candidate with no ties, no complications, someone the council could approve without a fight. He thought he'd found the safest, simplest solution to my deadline. A humorless laugh escaped him. Instead, he handed me the one person in the realm capable of ending the blight that's been quietly bleeding my kingdom dry for 3 centuries. You don't sound as relieved as I would have expected. I'm not relieved. I'm terrified. He said it plainly, without the armor he usually wore around his own uncertainty. If this is true, every enemy of this crown will want you dead before you learn how to use whatever you carry. And I don't know how to protect you from something I don't understand. Something in his voice, the raw honesty of it, undid a knot in Ren's chest that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since the wedding, since the harvest fire, since a lifetime of being told she wasn't worth protecting. You don't have to know how, she said quietly. You just have to decide whether you want to try. Cassian looked at her for a long, searching moment, and then, slowly, as though testing whether she would pull away, he reached out and brushed his fingers along the edge of the mark at her throat. The touch sent a shock through her, warm and startling, like the first spark of a fire catching. "I want to try," he said. "Not because of some ancient bloodline or a border I've been failing to hold for years, because somewhere in the last week, Ren called her, you stopped being the council's convenient solution and started being someone I actually don't want to lose. That's a significant shift for a man who married me for necessity 5 days after meeting me. People surprise you," he said. "You surprised me. It seemed only fair to return the favor." She laughed, unsteady and warm, and for a moment the weight of prophecy and border blight and 300 years of hidden history receded, and there was only the two of them, standing close in a candlelit study, a king and a healer's apprentice who had somehow, against every calculation the council had made, begun to actually choose each other. The moment didn't last. A guard's urgent knock broke through it, followed immediately by the man himself, breathless and pale. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. There's been an incident at the eastern gate. A rider was found unconscious, half frozen, claiming to have escaped an attack near the border village of Ashfin." The guard hesitated, glancing at Ren with an expression she didn't like. "He says the attackers weren't looking for soldiers or supplies, Your Grace. He says they were asking specifically about the new Luna. About where she came from. About a healer's cottage near the eastern border." The warmth in the room evaporated. Cassian's hand found Ren's without thought, his grip tightening. "Someone already knows," Ren said quietly. "Or someone suspects," Cassian said, "which, given what's at stake, may be just as dangerous." He turned to the guard, his voice hardening into the register of a king rather than a husband. "Double the watch on the Luna. Quietly, I don't want the court to know we're worried, only that we're careful. And send word to old Marin in the archive. If she knows what my wife carries, I want to know everything she knows about who else might be looking for it." The guard bowed and disappeared, and Cassian turned back to Ren, the warmth from a moment ago tempered now with something fiercer, more protective. "Whatever comes next," he said, "you won't face it as a convenient solution to my deadline. You'll face it as my wife, and I intend to make that mean something." Ren, who had spent her whole life being an afterthought, found she believed him. Lord Draven Ashcroft had spent the better part of the past year positioning himself as the obvious solution to the king's marriage crisis, and he had not taken it well when the council announced a healer's apprentice instead. He learned about the attack near Ashfin the same morning it was reported to the king, because Draven made it his business to know things a full day before he was supposed to, and he received the news with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a plan he hadn't authorized succeed anyway. "They found her village," he said to the woman seated across from him in his private study, a hooded figure whose face remained carefully obscured even here, behind locked doors. "That's further than I expected this quickly. They found a village that matches the descriptions," the woman corrected. "We don't know yet if it's the right one. The healer who raised her is being questioned as we speak. And if it is the right one, if this Emberwood business turns out to be more than superstition dressed up as a convenient marriage, then you have a problem, my lord. The kind of problem 300 years of careful history rewriting was designed to prevent." The woman's voice was flat, businesslike, the voice of someone discussing an inconvenient shipment rather than a bloodline. "Your ancestors did not simply defeat House Emberwood, Lord Draven. They erased them, and built their own claim to influence in this realm on the ashes of that erasure. If the line resurfaces now, in the king's own wife of all people, there will be questions asked about exactly how thoroughly your family accomplished that erasure the first time, and who benefited from it." Draven's jaw tightened, He had not clawed his way to his current standing, one of the most powerful lords beneath the crown, heir to a legacy built on land his family had acquired in the chaos following Emberwood's fall, only to watch it unravel because the council had gotten desperate and grabbed the first orphan they could find to solve a 5-day deadline. Then we make certain the questions never get asked, he said. Quietly, if possible, and if quietly proves difficult, then not quietly. Draven's expression didn't change, but something colder moved behind his eyes. The king married her out of pity and convenience. No one in that court has any real loyalty to her yet. If something were to happen to the new Luna before she has time to become anything more than an unfortunate footnote in the succession crisis, I doubt anyone would mourn her particularly deeply. The kingdom would simply return to needing a proper solution to the king's deadline, one with the right family behind her. You're proposing to kill the king's wife. I'm proposing to solve a problem before it becomes an unsolvable one, Draven said. There's a difference, if you look at it correctly. The hooded woman studied him for a long moment, and though her face remained hidden, there was something in the stillness of her posture that suggested she was recalculating whether Draven's ambition had outpaced his usefulness. The solstice tournament is in 10 days, she said finally. The king traditionally presents his new mate to the full realm at the tournament feast, a public display of the succession being secured. It draws every noble house, every foreign envoy, every set of eyes that matters in this kingdom. A great deal can happen in a crowd that size, my lord, if it's arranged carefully enough to look like an accident, or better yet, like the work of an enemy from outside our borders entirely. The northern raiders, Draven said slowly, understanding dawning. The ones responsible for the blight's spread. If something happened to the Luna at the tournament, and evidence pointed toward them then, no one would think to look toward a lord whose family has spent 300 years benefiting quietly from the very extinction her existence threatens to overturn. The woman rose from her seat, drawing her hood tighter as she moved toward the door. I'll arrange what's needed on my end. See that your part is handled without your fingerprints anywhere near it, Lord Draven. I did not survive this long by working with careless men. After she left, Draven remained at his desk for a long while, turning the plan over in his mind, weighing risk against reward with the same cold arithmetic he applied to every decision that had built his fortune. He thought of the healer's apprentice standing at the king's side during the wedding feast, unremarkable in her borrowed gown, easily dismissed, easily underestimated by everyone in that hall including, he suspected, herself. It would almost be a mercy, he told himself, to end things before she learned what she was capable of. Almost, he poured himself a glass of wine and began, with the careful, patient hand of a man who had built an empire out of other people's ashes, drafting a letter to an old contact along the northern border, the kind of letter that would never be traced back to his name, requesting a very particular kind of assistance at a very particular tournament. Marin returned to the castle the next morning with an armful of brittle old texts and the brisk energy of a woman who had waited 70 years for a purpose and did not intend to waste a single day of it now that one had arrived. We don't have time to do this properly, she announced, dropping the books onto the study table with a thud that made Ren jump. Properly would take years. We have 10 days before the solstice tournament, and given the incident at Ashfin, I suspect we don't even have all of those to spare. I don't know where to begin, Ren admitted, staring at the texts, their pages so old the ink had faded to brown ghosts of words. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be learning. You're supposed to be learning to stop being afraid of what's in your own blood, Marin said, not unkindly. The heart flame doesn't respond to technique, child, not the way a proper shift does. It responds to conviction. The old records say Emberwood heirs could call it only when they stopped treating it as a burden and started treating it as a birthright. Easy to say when you're not the one whose birthright apparently comes with an assassination attempt attached. Fair point, Marin conceded. Then, we'll start smaller. Close your eyes. Cassian, who had cleared his morning of council business against Marrow's vocal objections in order to be present for this, watched from across the room as Ren followed Marin's instructions, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hand pressed to the mark at her throat. Nothing happened, not at first, and Ren's shoulders sagged with frustration after several failed attempts. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I feel ridiculous." "You feel afraid," Marin corrected. "There's a difference, and the fire can tell the difference even if you can't." She tilted her clouded eyes toward Cassian, an unspoken instruction he seemed to understand immediately, because he crossed the room and knelt beside Ren's chair, taking her hand in his. "What are you afraid of?" he asked quietly. Ren was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. "That it isn't real, that Marin's wrong, and I'm not some lost piece of a legendary bloodline. I'm just a healer's apprentice who got lucky enough to marry a king who felt sorry for her. And any day now everyone is going to realize the mistake, and I'll be exactly what Talbot always said I was. No one of consequence." Cassian's grip on her hand tightened. "I don't feel sorry for you, Ren. I haven't for days. I stopped the moment you told a room full of nobles you could hear them talking about you. That's not the same as believing I'm the answer to a 300-year-old prophecy." "No," he agreed. "But it's the same as believing you're not nothing. And I think that's the part you actually need to believe first, before any fire responds to anything." He held her gaze, steady and certain in a way that had nothing to do with kings or crowns or ancient bloodlines. "You are not a mistake the council made, Ren. Whatever comes of this, whatever you can or can't call from your blood, you were never nothing. Talbot was wrong. Every noble in that ballroom, whispering behind their fans, is wrong. I need you to hear that before we go any further." Something in Ren's chest cracked open, an old, defended thing giving way at last, and when she closed her eyes again, it wasn't concentration she was chasing, but the warmth of his hand around hers, the unfamiliar, startling sensation of being wanted rather than merely accepted. The mark at her throat grew warm. Marin made a soft, startled sound. "Look." Ren opened her eyes to find a faint golden light pulsing gently beneath her collar, small and unsteady, like a candle flame catching for the first time in a cold room, but undeniably, unmistakably real. "That's it," Marin whispered, something like awe in her voice. "After 300 years, that's the heart flame." Ren stared down at the light, tears she hadn't expected pricking at her eyes, and Cassian, still kneeling beside her, still holding her hand, brought it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that had nothing to do with prophecy at all. "There she is," he murmured. "Not the council's solution. Just you." The light flickered brighter for a moment before settling. Small but steady, and for the first time since the harvest fire, since Talbot's cruel words, since a lifetime of being told she was worth nothing, Ren Calder let herself believe, just a little, that she might be worth a great deal more than anyone had ever bothered to tell her. Outside the study window, unnoticed by any of them, a raven perched briefly on the sill, tilted its head toward the glow, and then flew north, toward the border, toward a hooded woman waiting for exactly this kind of confirmation. In the days that followed, the castle began to feel less like a cage dressed up as a gift, and more, cautiously, like something Ren might one day call home. It was not a sudden transformation. The court still whispered, though with less confidence now that the Luna had taken to answering their insults with a wit sharp enough to draw blood. The council still eyed her with wary calculation, though Marrow, to his credit, had begun treating her with something approaching genuine respect since the morning he'd witnessed the faint golden glow beneath her collar during a training session he'd stumbled into by accident and never quite recovered from. And Cassian, cold and careful Cassian, who had married her out of necessity with his jaw set like a man bracing for an unpleasant duty, had begun finding excuses to seek her out that had nothing to do with council business at all. "You're supposed to be reviewing border reports," Ren said one evening, looking up from Marin's texts to find him standing in the study doorway with 2 cups of tea he clearly did not know how to explain having brought. "I finished the border reports an hour ago." "And yet, here you are. And yet, here I am." He crossed the room and set one of the cups beside her, settling into the chair across from her with none of the formal distance he'd maintained during their first days of marriage. "Marin says you called a full flame yesterday. Not just a glow. An actual flame. In your palm. For about 3 seconds before I panicked, and it went out." Ren wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for an excuse not to meet his eyes, because something about the pride in his voice made her chest do an uncomfortable, wonderful thing she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Marin says panic is apparently the enemy of everything useful about this bloodline. I'm starting to think Marin has strong opinions about my emotional regulation. Marin has strong opinions about everything. It's mildly terrifying, honestly, for a woman who can't see. She sees plenty. Just not with her eyes." Ren finally looked up and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't yet learned the name for, something warmer than the polite regard he'd offered on their wedding day, something that made the room feel smaller and considerably more dangerous than a study full of old books had any right to feel. "What?" "Nothing," he said, though the corner of his mouth had curved into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite anything else either. "I'm only thinking that Elder Marrow found you to solve a 5-day deadline, and instead he found the answer to a 300-year-old crisis, and somewhere in between those 2 facts, he also, entirely by accident, found me someone I actually look forward to seeing at the end of a long day. I'm not certain the council accounted for that possibility in their calculations." Ren's breath caught. "That's a very roundabout way of saying something, Cassian. I'm a king. We're taught to be roundabout about everything except battle strategy." He reached across the small table between them, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that startled her more than any declaration could have. "I married you because the law demanded a mate by the solstice, and you were the safest, simplest option my council could find. I want you to know that's no longer why I'd choose you. If I were choosing today." "Why would you choose me today?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Because you set a room full of nobles straight without raising your voice. Because you called a flame from nothing but grief and stubbornness, and refused to let either one define you as small. Because somewhere in the space of 2 weeks, Ren Calder, you became the person I want beside me, for reasons that have nothing to do with deadlines or bloodlines or anything the council could have planned." His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw with a reverence that made her heart stutter. "I'd choose you again. Every time. Necessity. Or not." Ren closed the distance between them before she could think better of it, and when their lips met, it wasn't the careful, formal gesture of 2 strangers bound by law, but something that tasted like choice, freely made, freely given. The exact opposite of everything either of them had expected from a marriage built on pity and political convenience. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, the mark at Ren's throat glowed steady and warm, brighter than it had in any of her training sessions with Marin. "I think," Ren said, laughing softly against his mouth, "that this bloodline responds better to happiness than to grief." "Then I suppose," Cassian murmured, pulling her closer, It will be my sworn duty as your king to keep you very, very happy." Neither of them noticed, in the warmth of the moment, that outside the tournament grounds being prepared 3 days away for the solstice feast, a shipment of northern steel had arrived under cover of darkness, addressed to no one, paid for in coin that traced back to nothing, and unloaded quietly into the private stores of Lord Draven Ashcroft. The solstice tournament arrived with the particular pageantry the Blackthorn court reserved for occasions meant to demonstrate strength to watching enemies, banners in every shade of the realm's colors, envoys from 3 neighboring territories seated in places of honor, and a crowd of nobles who had spent 10 days debating whether the healer's apprentice would embarrass the crown, or, worse, somehow prove herself worthy of it. Ren stood at Cassian's side as the tournament's opening rites began, dressed now in a gown that had been made properly, fitted to her, deep green shot through with gold thread that caught the torchlight, and she thought, with a small private satisfaction, that she looked considerably less like a mistake the council had scrambled to make, and considerably more like a woman who belonged exactly where she was standing. "You're doing the thing where you look like you're plotting something," Cassian murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear. "I'm doing the thing where I'm terrified and trying not to show it," Ren corrected. "Marin says the whole court will be watching for any sign the marriage is a failure. I'd rather not give them the satisfaction. They'll get no satisfaction from me. I plan to spend this entire tournament looking unreasonably pleased with my choice of wife, purely to spite anyone still hoping otherwise." Despite herself, Ren laughed, and the sound drew several curious glances from the nearest cluster of nobles, who had clearly expected the evening to proceed with considerably more tension. The tournament itself unfolded as tournaments always did. Contests of strength and speed among the realm's warriors, formal toasts between Cassian and the visiting envoys, the slow ceremonial procession that would end, traditionally, with the king presenting his mate to the full assembly as a symbol of the succession secured. Ren had been dreading that moment for days, certain it would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny Draven's allies were waiting for, and she was not wrong, though not in the way she expected. The attack came not during the presentation, but in the chaos immediately after, when the crowd rose in polite applause, and the careful order of the ceremony briefly dissolved into movement and noise. Ren felt it before she understood it, a wrongness in the air, the particular silence of the mark at her throat going suddenly, sharply cold, and she turned just in time to see 3 figures in Northern Raider garb converging on the dais with a speed and coordination no genuine raiding party would have managed inside a royal tournament's tight security. Cassian Heed already seen them. His transformation was immediate, brutal, the powerful shift of an Alpha King who had spent his entire reign being underestimated by exactly this kind of ambush, and he placed himself between Ren and the advancing attackers with a snarl that sent the nearest nobles scattering. The first attacker fell fast, Cassian's speed and strength more than a match for a single opponent, but the second and third pressed forward with a purpose that suggested they hadn't come for the king at all. Ren realized, with a cold-dropping certainty, that their eyes were fixed past Cassian, on her. "They're not here for you," she said, understanding arriving too late to be useful. "They're here for me. Then they'll have to go through me first." Cassian snarled, but even as he said it, a fourth figure emerged from the crowd's chaos behind them, a blade already drawn, moving toward Ren's unguarded back with the precision of someone who had planned exactly this moment for days. Ren didn't think. She felt the mark at her throat blaze suddenly, violently hot, and she spun to face the fourth attacker with her hands already rising, some instinct older than fear guiding the motion, and a burst of golden flame erupted from her palms, catching the attacker's blade and sending it clattering, molten and useless, to the tournament floor. The hall erupted into screams, courtiers scrambling for the exits, and in the sudden, stunned silence that followed the flame's eruption, Ren stood in the middle of the tournament grounds, with fire dancing across her hands. 3 attackers subdued or fleeing, and an entire court staring at her with expressions that had shifted in the space of a single heartbeat, from suspicion to something closer to awe. Cassian, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles from the fight, turned to look at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, pride and relief, and something fiercer than both tangled together. "Well," he said, into the ringing silence of the hall, loud enough for every noble, every envoy, every whispering courtier who had spent 10 days doubting her to hear clearly. "I believe the Council's convenient solution has just saved this entire tournament. I trust no one still has questions about whether my wife belongs on this dais." No one did. But across the hall, hidden among the fleeing crowd, Lord Draven Ashcroft watched the golden light fade from Ren's hands with an expression of cold, calculating fury, and understood that his careful, quiet plan had just failed in front of every witness who mattered in the realm. The captured attackers, once separated from the chaos and questioned under Cassian's unblinking gaze, did not hold out long. They were mercenaries, not true believers in any northern cause, hired through 3 layers of intermediaries designed to obscure the source of their payment. But Merrin, summoned from the archive the moment the tournament grounds were secured, needed only to examine the coin found on the lead attacker to identify its mint mark. "This wasn't struck in the north," she said, turning the coin over in her weathered fingers while the full council looked on. "This is Ashcroft minting. I'd recognize it anywhere. I catalogued enough of Lord Draven's family ledgers in my younger years to know his house's mark blindfolded, which, given my present circumstances, is somewhat unavoidable regardless." The accusation landed in the council chamber like a physical blow. Draven, who had positioned himself near the back of the room with the studied casualness of a man confident he had covered every trace of his involvement, went very still. "That's absurd," he said, too quickly. "Coin changes hands 1,000 times before it reaches a mercenary's pocket. This proves nothing." "Perhaps," Cassian said, his voice deceptively calm in a way that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Except that we also recovered a shipment manifest from the mercenaries' camp, delivered 3 days before the tournament, for northern steel weapons paid for in coin traced to an account that, curiously, shares its ledger keeper with your own household, Lord Draven." Draven's composure cracked, a hairline fracture that widened rapidly under the weight of the room's attention. "Whatever evidence you believe you've assembled, Your Grace, I would remind the Council that my family has served this crown loyally for 3 generations your family." Merrin interrupted, her clouded eyes fixed unerringly on him despite her blindness. "Built its fortune on land seized during the fall of House Emberwood 300 years ago. I imagine that history looks rather different now, doesn't it, my lord, with an Emberwood heir standing very much alive in this very room." The chamber erupted into stunned murmuring, and Draven, seeing the trap close around him from every direction at once, made the mistake every cornered man eventually makes. He reached for the blade concealed at his belt, lunging not toward the guards nearest him, but toward Ren, standing at Cassian's side, one final desperate attempt to eliminate the proof that threatened to unravel 3 centuries of his family's carefully constructed legitimacy. He never reached her. Ren felt the mark at her throat flare before she consciously decided to act, and the fire that answered this time came not in panic or instinct alone, but with a clarity she hadn't possessed at the tournament, a steadiness born of days of Merrin's patient teaching and Cassian's unwavering belief that she was not, and had never been, nothing. The flame wrapped around Draven's blade and wrist alike, not to harm him but to hold him, an iron grip of golden light that stopped him mid-lunge and left him gasping, more shocked than injured, suspended in place before the entire assembled council. "You spent 300 years benefiting from a lie," Ren said, her voice steady despite the fire dancing at her fingertips, despite the eyes of every noble in the chamber fixed on her. You tried to end that inconvenience with a knife rather than face what your family actually did to earn its fortune. I think, Lord Draven, that the council deserves to hear the whole truth now, don't you? Every layer of it, however uncomfortable it makes the history books. Cassian stepped forward, his voice carrying the full authority of the crown as he addressed the stunned chamber. Lord Draven Ashcroft is charged with conspiracy against the crown and the attempted murder of the Luna before witness of the full council. His holdings are seized effective immediately, pending a full accounting of his family's original claim to them, an accounting I suspect 300 years of careful record-keeping was designed specifically to prevent anyone from ever conducting. He turned, meeting Ren's eyes across the chamber, something fierce and unmistakably proud burning behind his own gaze. The realm owes House Emberwood a debt 3 centuries overdue. I intend to see it paid, starting today. The guards moved in to take Draven into custody, his protests dissolving into the general clamor of a council chamber processing a truth that would rewrite the realm's understanding of its own history. And Ren released the flame binding him, watching it fade from gold to nothing with a steadiness that surprised even her. Merrin, standing quietly to one side, allowed herself the smallest, satisfied smile. 70 years I waited to feel that pull in the air again, she murmured, mostly to herself. I confess I did not expect it to end with quite so much theater. But I suppose fire has always preferred a dramatic entrance. In the weeks that followed Draven's arrest, the realm changed in ways that no one, least of all Ren, could have fully anticipated when she'd first stood elbow-deep in feverfew paste and listened to a stranger tell her the king wanted to marry her. The council, humbled by the scale of what they had nearly caused through carelessness and nearly lost through Draven's ambition, threw itself into the work of understanding what an Emberwood heir could actually do for a kingdom that had spent 3 centuries slowly crumbling without her. Marin, delighted beyond measure to finally have a purpose worthy of 70 years of patient study, became a near-permanent fixture in Ren's company, the two of them poring over brittle old texts late into the night, piecing together fragments of a bloodline's history that had nearly been erased entirely. The border was the first true test. The Shadow Blight had crept forward another 2 miles in the time it took the court to process the truth about Draven and the northern villages. Weary from years of retreating ahead of its slow, creeping ruin, had little patience left for court politics or ancient bloodlines. They needed the blight stopped, not explained. The old records say the Heartflame was meant to be carried to the border itself, Merrin explained, spreading a map across the study table that showed the blight spread in ominous, spreading ink. Not simply called in a tournament hall to defend against a knife. The old wards were anchored at 4 points along the pass, stones the Emberwood line used to visit each generation to renew the binding. 3 centuries without an heir to walk that circuit is likely why the wards have been failing so slowly and so completely. You want me to walk into the blight itself, Ren said, understanding the shape of what was being asked before Marin finished explaining it. I want you to walk to its edge, to stones that have waited 300 years for someone to remember they exist. Whether the fire in you is strong enough to renew 4 centuries of binding, I confess I don't know for certain. No living person does. But I believe it, Ren, more surely than I've believed anything in my long life. Cassian, who had said little during the explanation, finally spoke, his voice carrying none of the cold calculation he'd worn like armor when Ren first met him. I won't order you to do this. Whatever the realm needs, whatever 300 years of history expects of you, you didn't ask to inherit any of it, and I won't pretend otherwise, simply because it would be convenient for my kingdom. Ren looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had married her out of necessity and somehow, improbably, become the person whose belief in her mattered more than any prophecy. And she thought of Talbot's voice at the harvest fire, the whispered insults of a court that had once dismissed her as a healer's apprentice, with no name worth mentioning. "I spent my whole life being told I was no one of consequence," she said quietly. "I'm not walking to that border because a bloodline demands it, or because the council needs a solution, or even because it's the right thing to do, though I think it probably is. I'm walking there because for the first time in my life, I get to decide what I'm worth, and I've decided I'm worth more than being afraid of my own fire." She left for the northern pass 3 days later, accompanied by Cassian, Marin, and a small guard the king had insisted on despite Ren's protests that an army would only slow them down. The journey took the better part of a week, the landscape growing steadily more desolate as they approached the Blight's edge. Trees stripped bare of color, rivers running strangely still, the air itself carrying a wrongness that made even seasoned soldiers uneasy. The first binding stone stood half buried in gray earth at the edge of the pass, its ancient carvings barely visible beneath centuries of neglect, and Ren knelt before it with a steadiness that surprised her, the mark at her throat already warming in recognition of something it seemed to remember even if she did not. "I don't know the words," she admitted, glancing back at Marin. "The old rituals, the proper invocation. I never learned any of it." "The old records suggest the words were never the important part," Marin said gently. "Emberwood heirs bound these stones with intention and fire, not memorized ritual. Speak from whatever's true in you, child. The stone will know the difference between performance and conviction, same as the fire in your own blood did." Ren placed her palm against the cold ancient surface and closed her eyes, thinking not of prophecy or duty, or the weight of 300 years of failed defenses, but of a healer's cottage that had raised her without ever knowing what she carried, of a village that had underestimated her, of a king who had chosen her twice, once out of necessity, and once entirely out of love. "I am Emberwood," she said, and for the first time in her life, the words did not feel like a legend borrowed from someone else's history, but a truth finally spoken aloud. "I choose to protect what's mine. This border, this realm, this life I never expected to be given, and refuse to let slip away now that I have it." The mark at her throat blazed, and gold light poured from her palm into the stone, spreading through ancient carvings like water finding old channels, racing outward along lines Ren couldn't see, but could somehow feel, connecting to 3 other points scattered across the pass, awakening a binding that had slumbered, half broken, for 300 years. The change was not instant. The blight did not vanish in a single dramatic burst, the way stories like to promise. But over the following days, as Ren visited each remaining stone in turn, Cassian at her side, through every mile. The gray, wrong stillness of the land began, slowly and unmistakably, to recede, color returning to stripped trees, rivers remembering how to move, the northern villages that had spent years retreating finally, cautiously, allowed themselves to imagine a future that didn't involve losing more ground. By the time they returned to Blackthorn Castle, the story of the Luna who had walked into the blight and pushed it back had already outpaced them, carried by every traveler on the road, and the court that greeted them upon their return bore no resemblance to the one that had whispered behind silk fans at Ren's wedding feast. "They're bowing," Ren murmured, startled, as they crossed the castle's entrance hall to a chamber full of nobles who had risen the moment she and Cassian appeared, heads inclined in genuine, unrehearsed respect. "They're afraid of you. A little," Cassian said, with something like amusement, "and they respect you a great deal, which, if I recall a conversation we had at our wedding feast, is finally the correct order for those 2 things to arrive in. I believe I said something to that effect. Yes, you did. I'm glad to see you were right." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together in front of the entire assembled court, without a trace of the formal distance he'd once maintained so carefully. Whatever this realm calls you now, Emberwood heir, Borders protector, Luna of Blackthorn, I only care about one title if I'm honest. And what's that? Mine, he said simply. Whatever else the history books decide to make of you, I'd like that one to stick above all the others. Wren, standing in a hall that had once dismissed her as nothing, surrounded by a court now bowing in genuine respect, married to a king who had chosen her twice over, decided that title suited her perfectly. A year later, on the anniversary of a wedding that had begun as a 5-day political scramble and become, against every calculation the council had ever made, a genuine love story, Blackthorn Castle hosted a very different kind of solstice celebration. The northern border, once marked in dark, spreading ink on every worried report, now held steady behind wards renewed by an Emberwood heir the realm had once nearly lost to a healer's cottage and a stranger's cruelty. The villages that had spent years retreating had begun, slowly, to rebuild, and word had spread far enough that other lost fragments of forgotten bloodlines, hidden away generations ago by families who feared exactly the kind of erasure House Emberwood had suffered, had begun, cautiously, to come forward, no longer afraid of what their blood might mean. Old Marin had taken up permanent residence in a study near the royal chambers, rather than her dusty archive, insisting she'd earned the better view after 70 years of waiting, and spent her days training a growing handful of young scholars in histories that had nearly been lost forever, delighted every single day to have students who actually wanted to hear what she had to say. Elder Marrow, to everyone's mild astonishment, had become one of Wren's staunchest allies on the council, prone to reminding anyone who would listen that he had personally recommended her, as though 5 days of desperate scrambling constituted a masterstroke of political foresight rather than sheer, dumb luck. Wren allowed him the fiction, mostly because it made him insufferably pleased with himself in a way she found more amusing than irritating. Lord Draven's holdings, seized and redistributed under a full accounting of his family's 300-year-old crimes, had gone toward rebuilding the northern villages that his ancestors' original conquest had displaced. A small, overdue measure of justice that Wren had insisted on personally, over the objections of council members who preferred history to stay comfortably buried. And in the private gardens where an old blind woman had first recognized a mark hidden beneath a traveling cloak, Wren stood now beside Cassian, watching the solstice fires being lit across the castle grounds below. No longer a healer's apprentice with no name worth mentioning, no longer the council's convenient solution to a 5-day deadline, but a Luna the realm had learned, slowly and thoroughly, to both fear and love, in exactly the right measure. Regrets? Cassian asked, echoing, perhaps deliberately, the question he'd asked her on their wedding night, when neither of them had known what the other year would hold. None, Wren said, and meant it completely. Talbot once told me no one of consequence would ever want me. I used to believe him. A little, no matter how much I pretended otherwise. She turned to face her husband, the mark at her throat glowing soft and steady, no longer a source of fear, but a quiet, constant warmth she'd come to think of as simply a part of who she was. I'd like to formally inform you that he was catastrophically wrong, and I intend to remind myself of that every single day for the rest of my life. I could remind you, if you'd prefer to delegate the task, Cassian offered, drawing her closer, the formal distance of their wedding day, now, nothing but a distant, almost unbelievable memory. I have considerable practice by now. I accept the offer, though I reserve the right to argue with you about it occasionally, purely on principle. Old habits. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, then, softer, to the glowing mark at her throat. An old scar turned birthright, turned simply. Finally, a part of the woman he loved beyond every calculation the council had ever made. Happy anniversary, Wren Ashgrove. Council's convenient solution. Kingdom's saving grace. My wife, my choice, entirely and completely, every single day since the first one. Happy anniversary, Your Grace, she murmured against his mouth, smiling. Try not to look so unreasonably pleased with yourself. The court is watching. Let them watch, Cassian said, and kissed her properly, in full view of the gathered court below, a king no longer hiding behind cold calculation, a Luna no longer hiding behind fear of her own fire, both of them finally, fully, exactly where they had always belonged, together, without a single doubt left standing between them. Above them, the solstice fires burned bright against the night sky, and somewhere beneath the castle's ancient stones, 4 renewed wards hummed quietly with borrowed warmth, holding steady, holding true, exactly the way love, freely chosen and freely given, always tends to hold when 2 people finally stop calculating what they owe each other and simply decide, against every convenient arrangement that first brought them unexpectedly together, to stay for good.